I'm your moderator today, and I founded two public relations consultancies predicated on establishing trust in communication. Joining us is Dr. John Blakey, the award-winning author of the best-selling leadership book, The Trusted Executive. Much of today's session will explore the new chapter in John's second edition of that book, which includes research conducted over 6 years in association with Aston Business School. Welcome, John. Shortlisted by the Chartered Management Institute as the Business Book of the Year, The Trusted Executive reflects on how authority has become a surrogate for trust and how executives should instead inspire others by role modeling the 3 pillars of ability, integrity, and benevolence. John is invited to give keynotes to leaders right across North America, Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, as well as appearing in print and broadcast media. Shortly, he will explain why power alone can no longer be relied upon by leaders today. Also talking to us is Russell Atkinson, former CEO of NAHL Group plc, now Director at Large, and Christine Alexander, CEO of healthcare organisation Vida. I will introduce them fully shortly before asking them to share their real-life experiences as trusted executives. It'll be fascinating to understand your journeys. Welcome to you both. Just a quick note to say that chat is open and we welcome your thoughts and questions there. But without further ado, John, please could you share your opening thoughts on why we're here today and your hopes for the next hour?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you for the next hour. Thank you very much, first of all, for carving out an hour of your busy days to be here for this launch of the second edition of The Trusted Executive. I'm incredibly excited to be here, and particularly excited to be here with Russell and Christine so that we can share this hour to talk about trust and leadership. I was thinking this morning about the launch of the first edition of The Trusted Executive 4.5 years ago, which was held at the National Liberal Club in London. And a lot has changed in the last 4.5 years. On the one hand, it would have been great to have been with you all stood on the terrace of the Liberal Club with a glass of champagne, looking out over the London Eye. But times are different, aren't they? And we're now gathered together in our Zoom rooms, wherever you are. So some things are harder, but some things are easier. And one of the great things about the next hour is that we've got people joining us from all over the world who wouldn't ever have been able to join us if we were holding this face to face. So I think I'm really excited about the idea of the inclusivity of this technology and bringing people together. I've even got members of my family on the Zoom call today and friends from my local village. So it's very much, as I say, a great gathering, and delighted that you've all made time to be here. So why are we here? Well, it's a celebration. It's a celebration of the launch of the second edition of The Trusted Executive. I don't know about you, but it's quite hard to celebrate on your own. Last night, when Birmingham scored their second goal against Reading, I did jump up and down in my lounge and got a very disapproving look from my son, Patrick. So you can celebrate on your own, but it's much, much better celebrating with other people. So this is a shared celebration, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share it with you today. But what a celebration of what? On paper, we're celebrating the difference between this, the first edition of The Trusted Executive, and this, the second edition of The Trusted Executive. So on paper, we're celebrating that. But really what we're celebrating is that every book is the celebration of a crazy idea that refuses to die in the mind of its author. In my case, that crazy idea is that what the world needs right now are leaders who rely on the power of trust rather than leaders who trust in power. And that crazy idea, as some of you will know, was born in a single conversation that I had with an ex-boss CEO of mine some 20 years ago. It's a story that I tell on page 9 of the second edition of The Trusted Executive. Many of you will have heard me use it because I use it for all the speaker sessions when I talk. It's the story of the best performance review I've ever had, when my CEO told me that I was too effing nice, too effing nice. So that comment ignited a spark in me that then became a raging fire. And 10 years later, it was still raging so hard that I enrolled on a PhD program at Aston Business School. It raged so hard that I wrote 2 editions of this book, The Trusted Executive. And it raged so hard that back in 2016, I founded a not-for-profit organization called the Trusted Executive Foundation with my colleague and friend, Mac Farker. That story is what Simon Sinek would call my why. So my why is that we need leaders who rely on the power of trust rather than leaders who trust in power. And that why has stayed the same from the first edition of the Trusted Executive in 2016 to this new edition 4 years later. So other than having a much prettier cover, what else has changed from the first edition to the second edition? There are three things that have changed in the last 4.5 years in our world of the Trusted Executive Foundation. And all three of those things are present today. The first thing that's changed is this beast. So this is my thesis from Aston Business School, which was completed in 2018. So 120,000 words, 6 years of research, 3 nervous breakdowns, and that's now done. And that has been used to inform this second edition of the Trusted Executive. The second thing that's changed is that 4 years later, we have people like Russell and Christine, leaders who have taken the theory of the 9 habits of trust and put that theory into practice. And that's why I'm so delighted to have them both here today, because the theory is all well and good, but unless leaders like Christine and Russell really work that theory day to day in the real world of leadership, then it's not going to make the difference that we hope it could make. And the final difference today is that the Trusted Executive Foundation exists. It didn't exist when the first edition of the Trusted Executive was established. That is a not-for-profit that is being created to define a new standard of leadership based on trustworthiness. And our mission is to help leaders like Russell and Christine and their teams to roll out this work in their organizations, but also in the process, we're looking to gift all the profits from that work to UK-based Christian-led charities that are inclusive at the point of need. Our 10-year courageous goal is to gift £1 million. And as of today at year 4, we've gifted just over £100,000 to that charity. So we're on the path, but we've got a long, long way to go. So that's what we're up to for the next hour. For the first part of this webinar, Andrew asked me if I could summarize my thesis in 10 minutes. And I said, Andrew, it's 120,000 words. It's 6 years work, 3 nervous breakdowns. How can I summarize this in 10 minutes? And he said to me, well, couldn't you just think of it as something like 5 things all leaders need to know about trust? And I said to him, that's a blog, Andrew, not a thesis. He said, well, yeah, do the blog version of the thesis. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and condense all of that into a blog piece chunk for you today. 5 things all leaders need to know about trust. And many of you will be joining in formal leadership roles. Some of you will be coaches. Some of you will be in other professions. And really, when you listen to these facts about trust, I want you to apply it to all the relationships that you have in your life, because trust is the glue of life, and it is the foundational ingredient in all human communication. So I want you to think about these facts in relation to whatever relationship you think that trust is key right now. So fact number 1, and I'm going to refer to my book as I do this. You can see I've got some nice little colored markers here that will allow me to give you a little burst of content for each of these facts. And the fact 1 is trust matters. So back in 1975, the researchers Golombowski and McConkie claimed that there is no single variable which so thoroughly influences interpersonal group behavior as does trust. My own research revealed that over 89% of board leaders consider trust critical to attracting and retaining top talent, 91% consider it critical to maintaining customer loyalty, and 88% consider it critical to achieving sustainable bottom line performance. Meanwhile, a guy called Dr. Paul Zak, he also researched trust in 2016, and he found that high trust cultures create 74% less stress, 50% higher productivity, and 76% more employee engagement. So I think all of those statistics confirm that trust is that magic wand. It is the one thing that changes everything. So trust matters. Fact number 2, and Christine actually reminded me of this fact when we did our preparation call. for this webinar last week. Fact number 2 about trust is that you can't control trust. And I'm just going to reference page 40 in the book. You, the executive leader, cannot control whether someone else will trust you, but you do have one powerful tool that influences this outcome: your own trustworthiness. The only piece of the trust equation that you can control is your own behavior. And we describe this as your trustworthiness, that's defined as a state in which an individual or a business is worthy of the trust of others. Trust and trustworthiness are often confused, yet the vital distinction is that you can choose to be trustworthy, but others have to choose whether they trust you. Fact number 3 and fact number 4 I'm going to do together because they happen to appear on the same page of the book. So fact number 3 is that your leadership matters. And I apply that term leaders. I think we're all leaders in different ways. We might be leaders in our families, in our organizations, but I think we're all capable of that leadership. Your leadership matters is fact 3. And fact 4 is you're not as good at this trust thing as you think you are. So let me just share with you some findings from my research. The single biggest factor in building a high trust culture is the behavior of the CEO and the senior leadership team. So we now know from the research that probably what a lot of us think is common sense, that the tone is set from the top, that role modeling, that leading by example, is the single most important factor in building a high trust culture. So your leadership matters if you're in a position of influence. The second aspect, though, is you're not as good at this as you think you are, because unfortunately, I can confirm from my research that the very same CEOs and leaders whose behavior is so important have a much rosier perception of their trustworthiness than the people who they lead. Typically, CEOs rate themselves 29% more trustworthy than others do. Also, they assess their organizations as being 23% more trustworthy than others do. I call this difference the authenticity gap. So that authenticity gap is the difference between our own perception of how trustworthy we might be or how trustworthy our businesses might be and the reality of what other people see. And obviously the smaller we can make that authenticity gap, the more we will be genuinely walking the talk of trust. So my final fact about leadership, about trust, is fact number 5. And fact number 5 is the good news from page 56 of the book, which is that you can get better at this if you really want to. So all the CEOs that I interviewed for my research were asked this question: how do you build trustworthiness? One of them replied, I'm not sure this is the right question, because I don't think you can build trustworthiness in people. You either have it or you don't. And so we test for it when we recruit people into the business. I'm sure other executive leaders would have a similar perspective. Can you really build integrity into someone? Or is it a fixed trait of character that defies further development? This argument reminds me of Churchill's famous quote about optimism. I suppose I'm an optimist. There seems little point in being anything else. So my glib answer to those who believe that trustworthiness is a fixed character trait would be, I suppose I believe that anyone can grow and change in profound ways. As a leader, there seems little point in believing anything else. So I do believe in the power of people's ability to change. That's why we talk about the 9 habits of trust, that first we make our habits, then our habits make us. If we make different choices, if we create different habits, then over time we will build our character. And if we build a character of trustworthiness and a brand of trustworthiness, that will be the magic wand that leads to all those fantastic outcomes that I talked about earlier. So that's it. That's 5 facts all leaders need to know about trust. That's a thesis condensed into 10 minutes. And just to conclude my section before I hand over to Andrew, that's the theory. As I say, I'm really delighted to have Christine and Russell here to talk about the practice today. It was Einstein that said, in theory, theory and practice are the same, but in practice they're different. And we all know that it's one thing to write a book, it's one thing to research a thesis, but putting it into practice is a different challenge altogether. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Russell and Christine talking about their experiences. Thank you, Andrew.
Many thanks, John. Christine Alexander started working for Vida 27 years ago as a frontline care worker. She became the CEO after just 5 years and has become an inspiring and ambitious leader in one of the most challenging sectors in our country, health and social care. With some 17 mergers along the way, Christine has grown the charity from a small local organisation in Nottingham to an England-wide organisation supporting thousands of vulnerable people and employing over 700 staff. Christine's focus is on finding solutions, looking for ways to make resources go further, looking for ways to use technology and digital solutions, and looking for ways to garner the goodwill that she sees within local communities. Families, friends, and community infrastructures are supporting people right where they live. And by working alongside them, she aims to avoid admission to expensive and often inaccessible long-term care. So, Christine, a few questions. I understand you first heard John speak in 2018 and were ordering the first edition of The Trusted Executive on Amazon before he'd even finished his presentation. Your organisation operates in a highly sensitive and complex environment, and it's been on the front line in response to the pandemic. I just wondered if you could perhaps explain how the 9 habits have guided you over the last year.
Yes, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, John, for the invitation today. Hearing John talk in 2018, it did immediately resonate with me, as I'm sure it does with many other people here today. With regards to the last year, I have to commend my staff for their response to this pandemic. The frontline staff of this thing have experienced considerable fear, isolation and potential financial hardship whilst working in the community, in people's homes, with patients developing symptoms of or already having COVID-19. For them, there is no clinical setting, there's no staff team to support them. They're pretty much alone out there in a patient's home with families and a patient who, quite frankly, are terrified of this virus. Our teams also care for people who are at the end of their life. So for them, developing symptoms results in them being taken off to hospital in an ambulance, with all parties knowing that family would likely never see them again. Our staff are dealing with the trauma of those moments on a daily basis. So our management staff have found that we've needed to use pretty much every one of the habits to guide us through the changes that we've had to make over this last year, and the support that we've needed to give to our staff teams around the country. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have heard John in 2018, and a little later we'll hear about the work that we've done that actually stood us in really good stead for this pandemic. If I had to choose habits that have served us the best over this last year, I think I would say that honesty and openness between ourselves as a staff team, moral bravery to stand firm in the things that we know we had to do to stay safe, and kindness, which we all know the impact of kindness that we've seen over this last year.
I wonder if you can just reflect a bit. How did you embed trust and the 9 habits in the DNA of the organisation?
Well, when I'd read the book after a couple of days of receiving it from Amazon, my senior leadership team and we embarked on a programme with John and his team. John and I spoke, and we realised that there was some work that we needed to do in our organisation. So for around 12 months, we immersed ourselves in the 9 habits framework. And we started to weave it into our processes and our practices throughout the whole organisation. And we embedded it into each of our strategic and our operational plans. We did that by not just bringing together my senior leadership team, but also a wider team of managers from around the country to work with them on cascading the 9 habit framework and the principles of trusted leadership throughout the whole of our workforce. I learned a really important truth during this programme, that actually behind every post holder in the organisation was a human being, one that wasn't always seen at work. Building trust with our employees, it enabled that human being to come to the fore, knowing that they were safe to show themselves. People quite often feel that they need to hide their values, their ambitions, their character even, and perhaps more so in the charity sector, and they focus on performing the functions of their role, earning their salary, paying their bills, etc. Embedding a culture of trust is about playing a long game. So getting it into the DNA of an organisation, it requires every manager to be on board. And I've learned a hard lesson through this process, and that's that my ability to operate as a trusted leader is only ever going to be measured by my weakest link in my organisation. This is an iterative process, and actually it doesn't ever end. The programme of embedding trust never ends.
Thank you, Christine. Russell Atkinson became Chief Executive of the NAHL Group following its admission to the AIM market in 2014, with him having joined in 2012. It's a leader in the UK consumer legal services market, providing products and services to consumers and law firms, including through the National Accident Helpline. Russell had a pivotal role in developing a group-wide strategy during a significant regulatory change in the industry. He was also responsible for financial performance, investor relations, and promoting the group's values, both internally and externally. The Trusted Executive Foundation has recently awarded Russell the Trusted Executive of the Year award. Russell, given the profile of NAHL and the exposure you gained through the AIM market, can you explain the relevance of the 9 habits in satisfying the needs of analysts, investors, the media, and others?
Certainly, yeah. That's actually, hi everyone, and again, I'm really pleased to be here today to be able to talk about my experiences. Yeah, the question is quite a tough one. The markets are unforgiving, and any public market is quite unforgiving. And I remember when I first took the role of CEO, somebody said to me that investors don't invest in a company or a person or a strategy; they invest in a share, and they'll very quickly sell that share if it's not meeting their needs. There are changes happening in the public markets. ESG, as it's known, is becoming more important to quite a large number of large institutional investors that are now looking at investing in companies that have a strong ESG platform and have a purpose and a set of values. And in a sense, the foundation that you get from the trusted executive helps you to create that. It helps you to create within an organization a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, a sense of meaning, because people buy into things when the management are trusted a lot more than they do when they're not. So it definitely plays a role in satisfying the needs, and it's a big but, I don't think that role is fully understood by investors, media, analysts, et cetera, because at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, it's about share price and it's about performance. So you have to have the faith that what you're doing by employing trust across your organization and leveraging trust within the organization is going to produce performance that will have the effect on the investors. I remember we do a roadshow. My former role, I must remember that. We did a roadshow every 6 months. So at your half-year results and full-year results, that consisted of about 30 to 40 hour-long meetings over a course of a week, explaining things to your investors. And only once in one of those hour-long meetings did anybody raise the issue of staff morale, staff engagement, trust, those kind of things. It was all about business performance. What's your cash flow? What's your debt like? All of those kind of things. So there's an awful long way to go in the city environment to get there, but it will play an important role, particularly as ESG becomes more focused in people's minds.
Thanks, Russell. I guess just diving in a little deeper then, the concept of a triple bottom line where you have results, relationships and reputation, that's becoming more universally understood. But given what you've said, what was your experience of operating in that unforgiving PLC environment?
I think with the larger investors, it was becoming more understood. Certainly, if you look at your report and accounts, for example, it's now almost compulsory. In fact, I think it is compulsory that you have an ESG section and you devote time to that particular area, and that's a really good move. And that's very, that's very positive. As you go down the scale of size of investors, this is typical. It's not, clearly there are examples of each and every one, but as you go down the scale, particularly down to small individual retail investors, my experience is very little interest in it. There are one or two, but you're sort of very little interest in that particular aspect. But it will change, because people are now realizing, we're seeing, one of the reasons I bought into this whole concept is because of the world in which we're living, where trust is in very, very short supply. And I think that is also understood by investors. I think the link, though, between company performance and trust has yet to be proven in many of their minds. Once that link's proven, I think it will become a much more important thing.
Thank you, Russell. John, in the new chapter, you say that only high trust cultures provide the psychological safety that modern stakeholders demand. Perhaps you can pick up on what both Christine and Russell have said and explain how to achieve this in the real world.
Yeah, just listening to Christine and Russell. I mean, Christine made that comment about the program never ends. That if you go on this journey of trust, and there are these 9 habits, we know that these 9 habits build that trustworthiness, but we also know that none of us are going to be perfect at all 9 habits, and no team is going to be perfect at all 9 habits. But it's a question of whether we have the motivation to keep going, to keep upping that game, and keep establishing a new benchmark. And Russell talked about that ESG factor, the environmental, social governance issues. Now, when I wrote the first edition, ESG wasn't a phrase that was even out there in 2016. But ESG now is quite a common acronym that is being used in PLC boardrooms. Investors are establishing ESG analysts who are researching companies around those factors. So that ESG is a sign of what's changed between 2016 and 2020. And I agree with Russell that even though this is still a minority sport, I think it's building momentum, and there are all sorts of trends going on in the world that means in 5 years' time, I think there'll be more and more conversations in more and more boardrooms about this. But we're not there today yet, and it is going to be a long journey. You mentioned psychological safety, which is again a phrase that 4 years ago I don't think I'd even heard that phrase discussed in a workplace context. But we're hearing a lot about psychological safety, and a lot of that goes back to a research study that Google conducted in 2016. They looked at 180 teams in Google and wanted to try and find out what is the highest performing team in Google. They called it Project Aristotle. And they were expecting that it might be the charisma of the leader or the fantastic technical expertise of the team members. But what they found surprised them, that the biggest single factor in the highest performing teams was this phrase, psychological safety. The teams where people felt psychologically safe turned out to be the highest performing teams. And I think psychological safety is the flip side of the coin of trust. If you've got trust, you will feel safe. And if you feel safe, you've probably got a high trust environment. So I think there's going to be a lot more talk in the coming years about how do we create that psychological safety. If you think about diversity and inclusion, mental health agendas, which again are much more prominent now in a lot of companies, a lot of this boils down to creating cultures where people feel safe to be who they are. And that's a high trust environment. And I think we're going to see more and more developments, more and more interesting sort of models and techniques that will come out to help us all create this psychologically safe environment. So I think that's an exciting agenda that's coming. And it's a phrase that you'll hear more and more often, I'm sure, in the coming years.
You mentioned a fascinating bit of research earlier with CEOs rating themselves 29% more trustworthy than others do. I'm interested to know how you got to that figure, but perhaps more importantly, what are the learnings from that?
Yeah, the way I got to that figure in the research, as part of the research, I surveyed over 500 leaders across many organizations, and also the CEOs of the same organizations. I'm using this model of 9 habits of trust. There are 27 behaviors that we can assess on a survey. And what we can do is we can ask the leaders, how they assess the CEO, and we can ask the CEO how they assess themselves. And that's where we saw this gap, this difference, 29%. Now, you know, I'm sure that if I surveyed my trustworthiness, I'm sure there would be a gap there as well. So I'm not trying to sort of pillory chief executives. I think we all have this blind spot between the reality of who we are and who we'd like to be and who we like to think we are. Now, the way to get past that and to work with that is, I think, measurement, is to get feedback, is to use models like this 9 Habits of Trust and the survey tool that we have with it to get real data, so that you're not fooling yourself either about your own trustworthiness or about the trustworthiness of your brand. Because if you can at least measure that gap, and if you measure it in a year's time and the gap's smaller, then great. You know, you're making progress. You're never going to be perfect with this. We're all going to make mistakes, but you know, at least measuring it puts it on the same footing in terms of all the other things that we measure in business routinely. Why don't we measure trust? You know, if it's that important, why are we not measuring it as a KPI in most businesses?
John, if I can quote you, you've said the case for change is no longer tentative, it's compelling. CEOs may not have worked out how to deal with the trust problem, but they certainly know it exists. But does that create a risk of trust washing? And how can that be avoided? And can you maybe explain a little bit more about your leadership survey tool?
Yeah, so this phrase, trust washing, people will have heard phrases like woke washing, green washing. You know, again, these phrases are coming into the mainstream. What does it mean? It really means that a lot of leaders sense that the world is changing, but their first reaction to that is to actually put a veneer over the surface of everything and try and pretend to be something that maybe we're not. Because, you know, it would be easier, wouldn't it, if we could do that? I mean, everybody knows that putting veneer on is an easy job. If you want to replace the whole floor with solid oak, that's a much bigger job. So I think at the moment, a lot of leaders are trying to work out, can we avoid doing the real job, the solid oak of trust? Can we get away with a veneer? Now, unfortunately, we live in a world where there's radical transparency. You know, the latest example, Kay Burley, Sky News, you know, the other night, she's out in a restaurant. And because of this transparency, social media, we all get to know about it. And then there are consequences of your words not matching your behavior. So I think it's that transparency that's going to force this job to be done properly eventually. But there will be a lot of incidents, I think, along the way where people will try to take shortcuts, businesses will try to take shortcuts, but I think they will be held accountable by an ever sort of scrupulous sort of public and stakeholders that frankly want to see something better.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Christine, someone once asked John whether leaders need to behave as though they're on video 24 hours a day. And I think you have had a daily Ask Christine call with your employees. Does it feel like you are under constant scrutiny from employees and indeed from other stakeholders?
Yes, it does actually. We did at the beginning of the crisis. We held these, we called them Ask Christine calls, just because we wanted to encourage our people to get in touch with us and address what at that time were extraordinary levels of fear and anxiety within our workforce. We just wanted to make ourselves available to them, let them talk, ask questions, or just share how they were feeling at that time. It did actually make a big difference just to create a forum. But as you mentioned earlier, Andrew, I've been doing this role for around 27 years now, but it's really the last 5 years, I've seen a really significant shift, a change for CEOs and all leaders, really. I found myself wondering from time to time what part reality shows have played in this desperate need for people to look through a window into other people's lives 24/7 round the clock. And whether it has or not, I don't know, but there seems to be a desire to find out who people really are. As CEOs, I do believe our roles now have become roles that are on video 24/7. What we think, how we feel, how we behave, what our personal values are. These seem to be the things that actually attract people to work for us, or it puts them off, depending on what those things are. I don't know, perhaps if that's not what we want as leaders, if we're not prepared to operate in that way and to have the openness and the transparency around our roles, if we're not prepared to make ourselves vulnerable to the things that everybody faces during the course of their lives, then perhaps we need to think about a career change, because I don't think that's going to change at all. I think there will become a greater expectation for transparency of CEOs and leaders.
Thanks, Christine. Russell, we've heard that role modelling, leading by example, are really potent levers in creating a high trust culture. Yet, as we've also heard, no one leader can be perfect. How did you go about role modelling and building a diverse team with members who actually excelled at all the different habits?
It's a good question, because I think role modelling, walking the walk, as they say, or talking the talk, is critically important. If you do what you say you will do, then people will begin to trust you. For me, it's about authenticity. You have to be authentic. You have to be open, and you have to be honest. Some of the things I did, firstly, getting the team involved. I was very lucky. We've been a values-led organisation all of the time. Before we got involved with the Trusted Executive Foundation, we recruit on our values. We look for we appraise, we reward, all on the values of the organisation. So we had a team that sort of fitted the values of the organisation, and trust became a sort of glue that we could use to start to evangelise to people how to behave and how to do things. But it had to start from me, and I think doing a few things quite deliberately that showed my own vulnerability were quite important. So I used to talk quite a lot to my team at management conferences, and actually at town halls for the whole team about my concerns and the fact that sometimes the imposter syndrome would hit me. I wasn't sure how I got to where I got to, why I ended up doing what I do, but I just do my bit, do it my way, as it were. And people seem to chime with that, and that gives other people the confidence to show their vulnerabilities, because only by showing your vulnerabilities as an organization and accepting that not everybody's perfect can you all work together. I was reading the chat actually that's going on during the conversation, and Nick asked a question about the link between individuals' creativity, innovation, and trust. Well, actually, it's absolutely critical link, because if people trust the organization, trust that people are not going to tell them that they're foolish or idiotic or stupid, but actually are going to nurture them, then you do get more innovation and creativity from those people. So acting it, being there, being at the front, admitting it yourself. There are certain elements of the 9 behaviors that actually are hard. They work against each other a little bit. They're quite hard to balance off. The one I use as an example is humility and evangelism. How can you get that one right if you're evangelizing about how good the company is, and are you being humble, and all of those things. But authenticity, it comes down to being natural, doing it the way that you feel comfortable with, and suddenly you find that your staff feel comfortable with it. Everybody feels comfortable. They understand that this is how it works. They can admit they're not maybe certain areas perfect, and everybody rubs along together.
That's great. Thanks, Russell. We've got some great questions dropping in, as you said, and please feel free to discuss anything you're hearing in the chat. John, there's a question here from Duncan Jones. Making trust the centerpiece of leadership and working relationships makes such sense. Why do you think it seems foreign to some employers?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And it's great to see all these comments and questions going on in the chat. Really great to see that happening. I think that question you've asked there, Andrew, Russell's already, I think, given us a little bit of a clue, that the world I grew up in as a business leader, the world that, a lot of us have grown up as business leaders, was a world where you were told you were too effing nice. If, you didn't buy into some of the norms of behavior that happen in some businesses, not all businesses, but, a lot of businesses. And you can argue about, well, where has that come from? Why did that happen? You know, there's a long history. I go into that in the book in terms of, you know, some of the thinking and theories that actually created those environments, that where trust wasn't the glue, fear was frankly the glue in a lot of those cultures. So there's all that past that we've all grown up with. You know, we've all lived in those environments, we've all worked in those environments, and we pick up habits. You know, you pick up habits from those environments, you carry it on. You don't always know what the alternative is. You don't always feel brave enough to pursue that alternative. But I think the trends that are going on over the last 10, 15 years, diversity, technology, social media, globalization, all of these trends, which I think are irreversible, they are creating a new environment, and the younger generation that is coming into the workforce is coming into that workforce with very different expectations about what great leadership is and what great leadership isn't. And actually, I think they're a braver generation than probably, you know, I was certainly at that age. That they're more brave to call it out. They're more brave to make choices based on you know, where they want to work. They ask more difficult questions. Sometimes that's irritating, but you know, it's healthy. So I think there are all these factors going on that mean we're at a certain inflection point in leadership. And you know, writing the book, Russell's work, Christine's work, everybody on this this call, I think we're all at the moment being challenged to decide where we stand. And it is a time to decide where you stand, to know where you stand. And if you stand for trust rather than power, then I think it's time to speak up. It's time to be brave, because the stakes are quite high. But there's a chance that we could really shift this thing in a great direction. It's not guaranteed. It's difficult, but who knows? If we all do our bit, maybe there's something worth going for there.
I think it's linked. Christine, I've got a question here from Craig Wood on vulnerability, and he's asking, how important is forgiveness when people miss the mark?
It's an excellent question, because there's been a culture within the world of work where things are not forgiven in the workplace, and everything shifts immediately towards performance management and performance review. And I do believe that this is why organizations committing themselves to a culture of trust is such an important part of this process, because you can't operate a culture of trust if you've got one department that do over here and another department that don't over here. You have to strike a balance, because at the end of the day, you have to run a business. I remember at the very beginning of our program, I was in a hotel room in North Yorkshire, and I had an absolute panic attack because I had a member of staff who was misbehaving so badly. And having read John's book and being immersed in this world of the 9 habits, I couldn't see how I could deal with poor performance whilst at the same time standing true and firm in those 9 habits. And one of John's colleagues very, very cleverly talked me down and taught me that actually those 9 habits are exactly what you need to be able to deal with the issues within your organization in the right and proper way. It isn't about accepting poor performance, and forgiveness is a great word. It's like that you go, goodness me, I wouldn't be a CEO today if I hadn't had way more than 2, 3, 4 chances, because you know, part of this culture is learning from our mistakes and spotting when you've got employees who are truly committed to the cause. They may trip up, they may make errors, but it's what you do with that. It's how people respond to your management, and using the framework of the 9 habits is absolutely the right way to be able to do that. And actually, you're more likely to hold on to your employees than in the old world of power and wielding a stick, and immediately jumping and taking people down a disciplinary route.
Yeah, John, we've got a really good question here on narcissism. And I know one of the habits is evangelism, which is something quite different, but I wonder if you could pick this up. Emily is asking what advice you might have for motivating those senior leaders and CEOs with narcissistic traits to build trust. Completely agree that trust creates psychological safety, and that leads to high performance. But narcissists typically want to break people down, not help them feel safe. And they're very common in the boardroom.
Yeah, Yeah, thanks for that question. And you know, that culture of power, that world of power, that, you know, that's what then breeds, you know, some of these behaviors, which we then call, you know, narcissistic. And you know, there's a lot of that's there. In terms of how do we engage that? I'm probably going to surprise you a little bit. I think that we need to be, first thing we need to do is empathize a little bit. I think we're all products of a world that's created, you know, a certain way of doing things, and we've all bought into that. We've all colluded with that to an extent. You get the leaders you deserve. So, you know, I think we've got to be careful about categorizing people into those that can be trusted and those that can't, because, as I say, nobody's got this cracked. We'll all have X% of narcissism in us somewhere. As one speaker said to me recently, you know, we've all got a beast in the basement. So I think we've got to have some empathy. I know I've got empathy for that, because I know that I've been in those boardrooms, and I know that I wasn't always the believer in trust that I am now. So, you know, there's plenty of people who knew me when I was younger who might say, crikey, I don't believe John Blakey's writing a book about trust. so you know, I think we've got to understand we're all on a journey with this, and the way we're going to get through it is not by sort of categorizing and stigmatizing. It's by understanding that there's lots of shades of grey. We're all sort of inherited a load of stuff, and we're all trying to work it through, and you know, we're all going to need help with that.
Thanks, John. Russell, one for you here. Having employed many millennials, I'm sure. A question from Nandor Makos. What do you think about the millennials' role in terms of spreading the culture of trust? They do not accept the glue of fear.
That's very true. I mean, millennials are looking to, in the past, and particularly my past, you know, looking at my generation, my age group, you joined an organization because of its status, its position. You kind of then sort of stuck with whatever you had. I think millennials come to things in a very different way. They're looking, and I don't mean this selfishly, but they're looking about what's in it for them. They're looking for an alignment with the values and the culture of the organization, and therefore that's where trust plays its role, because they want to work somewhere, or to be somewhere, particularly we're talking about organizations, so work somewhere that they can feel proud of. They can feel pride in the badge. They can you know, they can talk to their friends about, they can live with. So you know, it's very, very important that we use the power of the change that the millennials and others like them are bringing to try and harness this, because it's a fight that's of its time. The fight for trust is a fight that's of its time, but it's still there's a lot of years to go to roll this out, to get it going, because, you know, there's still quite a lot of inherent bad behavior within organizations and organizational environments.
Thank you, Russell. Christy, maybe you can pick this one up around equality and diversity. It's a question from Olivier Zemo. Do you think equality and diversity are key components of being a trusted executive?
I do, and everything we've seen over this last year points to that answer. I think that just as the effects of COVID are playing out, we're seeing so much distrust. And distrust is born out of our behaviours, whatever they are, whether it's to do with diversity, equality. The way that we behave is judged, and we have got to be inclusive. As leaders, we have to be inclusive to be able to tackle and to break down those issues that are within our communities. How we do that will be different depending on our organisations, the type of work we do, but we need to be able to hold a fair conversation, and that's a starting point that in itself is quite difficult at the moment. As I said earlier, you need to see the human being behind the persona, and even getting to a point where you can have a meeting of minds to have a conversation about the right way forward. That's a difficult thing to do in itself, but absolutely we have all got to really think about how we adapt what we do on a day-by-day basis to make sure that we're operating in a fair way.
John, you say in the book that as you go west from the UK, you find the habits of being open, evangelizing, and being brave getting stronger. Yet as you go east, you see the habits of being humble, being consistent, and being kind getting stronger. And I think maybe that links to a question we've had from Syed Aidid, who says that trust also depends on the culture of that society. In Malaysia, to gain trust by showing authentic vulnerability as a leader may backfire, as subordinates may use that openness against the leader. Just wonder what your comments were.
Yeah, thanks for that because the culture piece, we've talked a little bit about the culture of our organizations and the history of that and where that comes from and how it influences things. And certainly as you go to different countries and you talk about trust, you realize that there are the country cultures that have also created certain norms. And as I've gone east with this message, I mean, what you notice as you go east, that cultures, and I'm obviously going to generalize massively here, but it tends to get a bit more collective as you go east. It tends to get a bit more individualistic as you go west. Now, in a more collective culture, social norms, it's harder to break social norms. So things like showing vulnerability and being open, you have to be much braver to do that if that's breaking a social norm. But equally, I've seen, as I say, as I go east, there are other social norms like being kind, being consistent, that people again feel more guilt about breaking those behaviors because they feel part of this collective culture. When you go west, I think typically because it's more individualistic, it's easier to be brave. It's easier to show vulnerability because it's easier to break some of these social norms in those cultures. So what I've found is that all 9 habits are relevant in every part of the world, but the relative emphasis on them and the relative sort of gaps and challenges are different depending upon the history of that culture. But one of the things actually that somebody said to me, and it was in Malaysia where somebody said this to me when we were talking about this, somebody said, you know what, John, one thing's for sure is that the millennials have a much more consistent culture around the world, as a generation, and that generation doesn't have the same country cultural constraints as probably like my generation would have. So I think that's that other factor that's playing out.
Thank you, John. Russell, I'm going to link 2 questions here. John says in the book that there's a possibility that male leaders have a particular issue here, having often been conditioned to be strong and ruthless, even though they may be kind in their personal lives. And then I've got a question from Graham that says many executive decisions will continue to be perceived as detrimental to employees. Matters of pay, redundancy, and promotions that all introduce difficulties for employees to accept. How do you retain trust when such hard decisions have had to be taken? For you, Russell.
Yeah, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm muted. Yeah, I just muted because the dog was barking. So there you go. That's authentic for you. Yeah, that's a great question from Graham about that. And we had that at my organisation during COVID. We had to make some really tough decisions. So we've spent 2-3 years working on the trusted executive. We've been talking about how trustworthy we are, and then you still have to make those decisions to close down 2 of our offices, to furlough a big percentage of our staff, to make a large number of people redundant, and it's tough. I liken it to, in some ways, with trust, it's like a bank account. You're building that bank account by behaving in the way that you do. You're building that goodwill. That's the currency of trust. And then at a time like that, you start taking money out of that bank account. And you have to work very hard. The key to it for me, and I don't know if I got it right or not, I hope we did. I got some very good feedback, is explaining why you were making the decisions, what it is, being honest and open. So using those behaviors and trying to explain to people the reason why you have to take those decisions. We talked about the long-term health of the organization, the fact that it was going to be tough on some, but actually it would be better for us all in the long term. And also trying to, without being crass about it, trying to show that you're sharing in that. We all took, my executive team and myself, we all took a 20% pay cut at that particular time for that period, because we felt that that was the right thing to do if we're asking our staff on furlough to do the same. So it's just, you be honest, be open, explain, and try. Do you get it right with everybody? Probably not. Will some people still resent it? Yes, possibly. But overall, our staff understood it, and we got very, very good feedback when we surveyed them during the course. The question about male, yeah, I mean, it's a real tough one. I think there are for males of my generation, you see the grey hair, then there is a little bit of a conditioned. This is what we're supposed to think, feel, and react like. But actually, this is where I think things like Trump have been extremely helpful. Because when you see a behavior exaggerated to its extreme, as it has been in that particular environment, it's part of the process of saying, we can't behave like that. And I think many males have done that and realized that they have to change. Diversity helps, because having a diverse board, our board was 50-50 male and female. And it really helps, because you then start to get all of the benefits of, and I won't go into those because I'll probably get it all wrong and I'll be pilloried for it, but you get all of the different pluses and negatives of doing that. So it is tough, but I do think that there is a certain amount of, for my generation, being a male means being this, but you just got to get over it and realize it doesn't anymore.
Thank you, Russell. We're approaching the end of our time together, so maybe I could just get 30 seconds from each of the panel. Global citizens expect not only great products and services, but also great companies that contribute to society. And John says every company needs a Greta. But given there's only one Greta, I wonder how organizations can develop their conscience. John, would you just like to go first on that?
Sure. Yeah. So every organization needs their Greta. How do you find your Greta? Well, it's probably the person that annoys you, that maybe at times you think is a bit of a troublemaker, that somehow doesn't seem to fit in as much as you might want them to at times. That's probably giving you a clue that that's where Greta's voice is going to be heard. And it is about sort of steeling yourself to listen, to hear that, to struggle with it, to maybe at times disagree with it, but to get into the dialogue, get into the conversation, because the conversation's coming. You can't avoid it. The conversation is going to find you. So why don't you try and find it first? Because that way you can. First 4 words in my book is managers manage, leaders anticipate. And if we're anticipating this, then we will welcome the Greta conversation before it comes to our front door.
Thank you. Christine?
There we go. That's got it. Yeah, thank you. I completely agree with John. I think the answer to this question is that we listen to those voices that are the loudest, and they're the ones that we want to ignore the most. And we've seen that certainly a lot over these last few months. Those people who are shouting the loudest, they're our Gretas. And we've got to somehow find a way to embrace their views and make sure that we integrate those views within our own strategies and build our organisations on an inclusive approach rather than an exclusive one, which is how it's always been in the past.
Thank you. And Russell, how do we develop a conscience?
It's difficult to follow that, because I agree with everything that John and Christine have just said, but I just think Greta isn't a person, it's a voice, and it's a collection of voices, and it is all about listening. You develop a conscience by being open to listening to everything, positive and negative. Fantastic.
Thank you. Well, our hour has really flown by, and I'm afraid we're going to have to call a close to proceedings now. I hope you found the discussion as stimulating and thought-provoking as I did. To order the Trusted Executive second edition with that 20% discount, please visit the Kogan Page website. The link's in chat, and we'll circulate that in a note after this event. We have recorded today's session, so do feel free to watch it back and do share the link with colleagues. So on behalf of us all, I want to say a massive thank you to Christine, to Russell, and of course to John. And if you're having a break, please have a great festive period, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks all. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Russell. Thanks, Christine. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. Have a great day.